Hey guys! Tonight we drift softly, slowly across a lake so still it mirrors the morning sky. You're in a canoe. Of course, everyone is. The paddle dips into the water without a sound. It's not even sunrise yet, but light is already blooming along the edge of the volcanoes. The air is damp and thick with the smell of lake reeds, wood smoke, and something faintly sweet, maybe roasted maize, maybe rotting lily pads. Hard to tell, honestly, all around you. Tiny green islands float, not really float. You'll learn, but seem to, like lazy pancakes dotting a silver-blue skillet. These are chinampas, the infamous floating gardens of the Aztec world. But they're not floating like lily pads. They're staked deep into the lake bed, anchored with willows and mud. You'll get muddy too, soon. That's not a spoiler, it's a promise. You probably won't survive this. By the way, not just because you're wearing sneakers in a swamp, or because the mosquitoes here treat strangers like free tapas, but because the pace of life on this lake is so slow, so mesmerizing, that you might dissolve into it if you're not careful. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You squint at the horizon as the mist parts, revealing the lake in layers. It's not just water. It's water pretending to be land, and land pretending to be water. This place, Lake Texcoco, is both cradle and trap. It floods when it rains too hard, dries out when it doesn't, and grows algae. The way your bathtub grows regret when you ignore it. The Aztecs didn't choose this place because it was perfect. They chose it because it was sacred. The story goes that their god, Huitzilopochtli, told them to look for an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a snake. You've probably seen this image on the Mexican flag. When they saw it right here, they knew they'd found their home. Except it was a swamp, a literal marshland. But to the Aztecs, that wasn't a deal breaker. That was a challenge. And when someone says, "Bet you can't build a city in the middle of a lake," the Aztecs respond, "Hold my fermented maguey sap." You pass by one of the older chinampas, its banks sagging, reeds fraying at the edges like a well-worn sock, but its core is strong, built on layers and layers of lake mud, woven mats, and swamp plants. Some say these gardens were so productive that they could yield 7 crops a year, which is a lot for a plot of land smaller than a modern backyard. Historians still argue whether this number was exaggerated by enthusiastic friars, or if it was the ancient equivalent of influencer crop rotation. Either way, you can feel it under your feet. This is soil that doesn't quit. Your guide, an old woman named Itzel, paddles ahead of you without saying much. She doesn't need to. Her canoe is filled with marigolds, amaranth, and tiny ears of maize so bright they look painted. She's been doing this since before you were born, probably before your socks were manufactured. She gestures to a stretch of chinampas ahead and says, "These ones are for the festival. Only the best plots get the flowers." You nod, though you're not entirely sure what she means, but it sounds right. Flowers for a festival. Good dirt for good souls. The wind picks up, rustling the willows planted along the edges. These trees are not just decoration. Their roots help anchor the whole structure. If a chinampa were a cake, the willows would be the skewers that keep it from sliding apart. Fringe, historians like to say the Aztecs invented permaculture before it was cool. You're inclined to believe them. These floating gardens weren't just smart, they were art. Your paddle hits something hard. You look down. It's a sunken basket, half covered in silt, filled with what looks like obsidian flakes and corn husks. A little shrine, a farmer's offering. A piece of trash from 500 years ago. No one knows, but it's there, watching you, judging you. Maybe, definitely soggy. There's a gentle rhythm to this journey. The canoe rocks with each push of the pole. The water laps against the sides, soft as a breath. Somewhere, a bird calls a haunting, flute-like note that sounds like a spirit whistling through a reed straw. You wonder if the gods of this place ever rest, or if they float just below the surface, listening. Suddenly, a splash, something big. Maybe a fish, maybe a frog, maybe a crocodile with commitment issues. You freeze. Itzel chuckles. It's just the lake, she says, but doesn't elaborate. You pretend that's comforting. As the sun finally breaks through the haze, the gardens shimmer. The light hits the dew on the leaves, turns the maize into golden spears, the amaranth into magenta fire. This isn't just agriculture, it's stagecraft. And you're seated front row, with a paddle in your hand and suspiciously damp socks. You pass another chinampa, this one being rebuilt. Workers lay down reeds like carpeting, scoop up lake mud with their bare hands, and tamp it into shape like stubborn clay. There's no yelling, no rush, just the steady pace of a people who've done this 1,000 times before. A chorus of frogs provides the percussion. You sit quietly and wonder what you've gotten yourself into. A lake that thinks it's a city that grows on gardens that aren't quite land. A journey where every step could mean learning, sinking, or both. And still ahead of you, more mud, more marvels, and probably one deeply opinionated bird. You trail behind Itzel now, your canoe lazily bumping into hers every few strokes. She doesn't seem to mind. Maybe she's used to clumsy newcomers drifting along like lost laundry. The sun climbs higher, scattering light across the water, and you finally reach Chinampa under construction. A muddy, glorious mess. This one's still in its skeletal stage. The workers barefoot, knee-deep in lake goo, move with practiced ease. First, they drive long willow stakes into the lake bed in a tidy rectangle. These stakes will take root and grow into trees. But for now, they're the bones of the thing. You grab one and immediately regret it. It's slippery and somehow colder than your future. Then come the reeds, thick mats of woven tulle reeds, bundled like soggy placemats, are laid between the stakes to form the bottom layer. It looks flimsy. Honestly, you wonder if a strong gust could send the whole thing to pieces like a lasagna in a rainstorm. But they've been doing this for centuries, so maybe trust the process. Now comes the mud black. Rich, disturbingly squishy, dug up from the lake floor with baskets. It's dumped onto the reed mats by the heaving armload. It smells intense, like dirt that has opinions. The workers mix in rotting vegetation and bits of old compost. You're pretty sure you saw half a gourd and someone's lost sandal in there. You grab a basket to help, and within 2 scoops, your fingernails look like they've been personally cursed by a swamp priest. One worker laughs and says something in Nahuatl that you don't understand, but you assume it's friendly, or pitying, or both. This, apparently, is the secret sauce. Layered mud and organic debris building up over time until it becomes a platform strong enough to hold trees, crops, and your existential confusion. Some archaeologists compare it to composting on steroids. Others point out that it's surprisingly similar to modern biofiltration systems. Historians still argue whether the system evolved gradually from reed rafts or was deliberately engineered as a radical ecological innovation. Either way, it works. Eventually, the topsoil gets added a light, crumbly mix that's soft beneath your feet. You kneel to press your palm into it and leave a perfect print. It's like clay that's been blessed by the gods of gardening and mild lower back pain. Then come the plants. Maize first, always. You press the seeds into the soil one by one. It feels ceremonial, even though you're sure Itzel is watching and judging your technique. Then beans, twining things that will soon climb the maze like overachievers. Then squash, the lazy cousin of the group, sprawling low across the dirt like someone who refuses to sit in chairs. Each chinampa is carefully arranged for maximum crop rotation, which means you can get multiple harvests in a year with just the right layering and watering. It's absurdly efficient. You wonder how many meetings it would take a modern urban planner to approve this kind of system. Probably a decade, with PowerPoints. Here, they just build it. And here's the quirky bit. Chinampas don't sit idle between planting seasons. No, they get re-mudded. Like facial masks for the land, you drag a reed sled over the surface, spreading lake silt evenly across the garden like frosting on a cake. A cake that occasionally belches methane and might contain frogs. Speaking of frogs, there are a lot of them. Fat ones, tiny ones, suspiciously judgmental ones. You spot one sitting on a basket handle, looking like it's about to file a formal complaint with the lake gods. It doesn't move. You don't either. A frog standoff. You blink first. Itzel walks over and hands you a bowl of something warm atoll. A maize-based drink thick enough to qualify as a building material. It tastes like comfort and vague regret. She sits beside you and taps the muddy bank. We build, always build, she says. Then, as if that explained everything, she gestures toward the next chinampa rising nearby. You glance around. Each one of these garden islands has been constructed by hand, each one layered and shaped and coaxed into existence. This isn't just farming, it's a form of quiet, persistent artistry, like quilting, but with more mud and occasional egrets. You look down at your hands. The dirt is caked under your nails, crusted along your wrists. You don't mind. There's something grounding about being part of the building process. You're not floating anymore. You're rooted. But don't get comfortable, because next comes the maintenance. These gardens may seem peaceful, but they're alive, and alive things need attention. You'll be expected to check the water flow, trim the willows, retie the reed banks when they sag, and this one's important, watch for collapse. Sometimes the lake decides it wants its mud back. Entire sections can slump into the water if not watched. Itzel calls this the chinampas' hunger. You call it a good excuse to not get attached to anything. The sun is overhead now, warm but not cruel. The lake glimmers like scattered glass somewhere in the distance. You hear singing workers keeping rhythm as they pull baskets from the lake. A slow, looping tune that rises and falls like the chinampas themselves. You lean back and let the boat drift for a moment. You're not floating, but the world around you is gardens growing on water, water feeding the gardens, and you, somewhere in between, wondering how something so ancient still feels like science fiction. By now, you've developed a love-hate relationship with mud. It's under your nails, in your shoes, probably behind your ears, and yet, somehow, you're starting to admire it. This black, gooey, miracle substance has turned a lake into farmland. But as Itzel guides your canoe to the edge of another chinampa, she drops a truth bomb with a grin. They don't float. You know, you blink. What? She repeats it. They're called floating gardens, but they don't float. You stare down at the garden beside you. It looks floaty. Suspiciously floaty. It's surrounded by water. It's covered in plants. Isn't that the definition? Apparently not. Chinampas are built on shallow lake beds, staked into place with trees and logs, layered from the bottom up like extremely stubborn lasagna. They only look like they're floating, kind of like how your enthusiasm at work might look real from a distance. Historians still argue whether the term floating came from early Spanish observers being poetic or just confused. Some believe it was metaphorical, tied to indigenous mythologies of water and fertility. Others think the term stuck because, well, it made for good storytelling. You trail your fingers through the water. It's shallow here, maybe 2 feet deep, maybe 3. The garden beside you is solid as a kitchen floor, just cooler and significantly more frog-scented. Itzel taps the side of the boat and gestures to a row of willow trees, their roots snaking into the lake like lazy tentacles. These are the anchors. When they grow tall and thick, their roots grip the garden's edge, keeping the entire structure stable during storms and floods. They're functional, yes, but also beautiful, draping like curtains over the water's edge. The funny part, some of the earliest chinampas were closer to floating rafts, temporary platforms used before more permanent ones were staked into place. You imagine an early farmer paddling a seed-covered raft across the lake, accidentally inventing sustainable agriculture while trying not to tip over his morning tamales. In time, those rafts evolved into permanent plots. The willow stakes, the mud layers, the rectangular layout, it all became standardized, like the ancient version of zoning codes, but with fewer lawsuits and more herons. Speaking of herons, you're being watched again. One stands on the edge of a chinampa ahead, tall and emotionless, like a feathery statue of judgment. Its neck tilts slightly. You wave, it blinks, unimpressed. You feel mildly scolded. You float past rows of crops that defy gravity, logic, and your own gardening track record. Tall maize stalks rustle gently. Amaranth leaves shimmer red and green in the sun. Squash vines sprawl like they've never heard of personal space. The way it all works together is unfairly elegant. The crops benefit from the constant availability of moisture thanks to the surrounding lake water. The soil never fully dries out. It's like the plants have room service hydration on demand. And the canals between chinampas, they're not just for paddling produce around. They act as natural irrigation systems, helping to regulate moisture, temperature, and even microclimates. You're basically standing inside a pre-Columbian greenhouse designed by a civilization that hadn't even invented the wheel. There's a moment where you let yourself believe you've understood everything, and then Itzel gestures to a plot with what looks like freshly turned soil and says, "That one collapsed last week." "Excuse me?" She nods. "Too much weight." The old mud layers gave out. You glance at your feet. You suddenly remember how this place is made of mud, reeds, and more mud. It's strong until it isn't. Turns out, chinampas require constant maintenance. If the layers get too thick or the organic matter rots unevenly, sections can slump or slide into the water. Sometimes they're rebuilt, sometimes they're abandoned. You imagine that in ancient times, this was just part of life. Build, grow, collapse, rebuild. A lesson in patience, or futility, or both. You sit back in the canoe, overwhelmed in the best way. Nothing here is quite what it seems. Floating gardens that don't float. Land made of water. Cities made of mud. It's like the Aztecs looked at nature and decided, yeah, that's cute, but let's hack it. You pass a man tending to a chinampa with a long wooden rake. His straw hat hides most of his face, but you catch a glimpse of his smile. He's raking silt, slowly, methodically, like a monk tending a Zen garden. Except the Zen is interrupted every few minutes by a goose with no sense of boundaries. Further along, a woman drops cuttings into the water. You ask why? She explains they're willow shoots, meant to root along the canal and replace old stakes. It's a living repair system, self-renewing. The way nature intended, if nature also had project managers. You pass another plot and spot something shiny sticking out of the soil, an ancient obsidian blade, half buried, glinting like forgotten memory. Probably a tool, possibly a ritual object. Definitely something you wouldn't want to step on barefoot. The sun begins to dip, turning the water amber. Shadows stretch across the gardens like soft fingers. You close your eyes for a moment and let yourself believe just for a heartbeat that you're part of something ancient, something bigger, something that grows even as it sinks. The boat drifts on. You trail a hand through the water, watching the ripples fade. Nothing here truly floats, but everything here endures. Your canoe drifts onward, guided now more by rhythm than direction. You've lost track of where you started and it doesn't matter. The lake has a way of swallowing straight lines and schedules. What remains is sensation, the slap of a paddle, the weight of sunlight on your shoulders, and the way every corner of this place hums with life. And then, rising before you, like a mirage stitched from stone and salt, Tenochtitlan. You've heard of it, sure, maybe saw it in a textbook once, something about the Venice of the Americas, but the comparison doesn't do it justice. Venice is a floating tourist trap. Tenochtitlan was a city that devoured a lake and then dared the world to tell it no. Imagine this, a bustling metropolis built smack in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 long causeways wide enough to fit carts, warriors, and the occasional awkward llama. Canals crisscross the city, forming watery streets where canoes glide silently beneath stone temples and market stalls. It's not just a city, it's a hydraulic dreamscape. You paddle closer. The air smells different here, smokier, spicier. Someone is grinding cacao nearby. Somewhere else, maize tortillas sizzle over clay griddles. You hear music. Laughter, a baby wailing, a dog barking at nothing. The city breathes. So do you? Itzel nudges your arm and points out the system of aqueducts running overhead, bringing fresh water from the mainland to thirsty residents. Its engineering so elegant, you wonder how many PowerPoint presentations it would take to convince a modern city council to attempt the same. Spoiler, too many. You pass under a stone archway covered in glyphs. A canoe stacked high with squash glides past you, piloted by a teenager who steers one-handed while eating a tamale. Show off. On either side of this canal rise chinampas. Not gardens now, but urban farms growing food for thousands of city dwellers. Some are filled with flowers, others with herbs, and a few seem to be entirely devoted to chilies. You feel both impressed and slightly attacked by the pungent air. Tenochtitlan's population may have reached over 200 Zeruzan at its peak, which made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Historians still argue whether it was more populous than Paris or Constantinople in the same century. But one thing is certain, this lake city thrived. You float past a woman selling axolotls in clay jars, adorable, pink, perpetually smiling salamanders that the Aztecs both adored and, well, occasionally ate. You try not to make eye contact with one. It blinks. You feel judged. Someone splashes you accidentally with their paddle. You almost protest, but then realize your whole lower half is already damp. At this point, your skin may just absorb lake nutrients directly. You stop at a market chinampa, dock beside a wooden platform. It's chaos in the best way, vendors shouting over one another, spices flung through the air like confetti, children chasing dogs that are chasing ducks, that are chasing some kind of fish. You buy a roasted maize cake wrapped in banana leaf. It tastes like childhood, even if it's not yours. The deeper into the city you go, the more you realize this place isn't just using water, it's built from it. Temples rise from the lake like ideas made solid. Priests paddle between neighborhoods offering blessings and probably unsolicited advice. Couriers deliver messages via canoe like feathered UPS drivers. And yet, even here, the chinampas persist quiet. Green rectangles tucked between temples and homes, always growing, always giving. It's like someone sprinkled farmland into every corner of the city, just in case someone got hungry between ceremonies. There's something comforting about it. This blend of wild and ordered, sacred and swampy. A city that doesn't just sit on the water, but partners with it. You think of modern cities with their concrete, their right angles, their allergy to moisture. You wonder what they lost when they dried everything up. A child waves to you from a chinampa filled with marigolds. You wave back. They toss you a flower. You catch it awkwardly. It smells like sunshine and something older. Itzel glances toward the sky. Storm season's coming, she says. And just like that, you notice the clouds, dark, swollen, slow-moving like ancient thoughts. Tenochtitlan knew how to handle storms. Its engineers built dikes and levees, dividing the lake into salty and freshwater zones. You float near one now massive, wooden reinforced, still solid after centuries. The idea was to manage water, not fight it. A philosophy modern cities could probably learn from. If they weren't so busy building parking lots on floodplains, you imagine living here, canoeing to school, growing tomatoes in your front yard, trading herbs with your neighbors, living not above the water, but with it. But then a voice inside you whispers, this city isn't here anymore. And that's true. After the Spanish arrived, after the siege, after the burning, the flooding, the razing Tenochtitlan vanished, buried under the weight of conquest and concrete. Today, it's Mexico City. The lake is gone, paved over. The canals are shadows. The chinampas, a few remain, clinging to the edges of Xochimilco like memories that refuse to fade. You sit with that for a while, the weight of it, and then Itzel paddles on. The gardens are still here, she says. You follow. You trail behind Itzel once more, the chinampas narrowing now into a maze of green. The city recedes behind you, and something quieter takes its place. The sound of paddles tapping water, wind whispering through maize leaves, and birds arguing over nothing. You breathe in, and there it is again. That strange, sweet smell, corn, beans, and squash, the holy trinity of Mesoamerican agriculture. The Three Sisters, as they're sometimes called today, though the Aztecs wouldn't have used that phrase. Still, they treated these crops like family inseparable, complementary, and occasionally tangled together in ways that made harvest a mild workout. Your canoe drifts beside a chinampa freshly planted with all three. The maize rises first, tall and proud, the structural diva of the group. Next to it, beans spiral upward, twining around the stalks like overexcited toddlers climbing a parent's legs. Below them, squash sprawls outward, its broad leaves shading the soil and quietly hogging space like a roommate with too many throw pillows. The genius of this system lies in its mutual support. The maize gives the beans something to climb. The beans fix nitrogen into the soil, feeding the maize. The squash shades the ground, keeping it moist and discouraging weeds. It's a living architecture of cooperation, a kind of plant-based utopia. You wonder how long it took someone to figure this out. Probably longer than you took to figure out how to microwave popcorn without burning it. Itzel reaches into the soil and pulls out a white grub the size of your thumb. She squints at it, then tosses it to a bird who's been watching you both like an unpaid supervisor. Good for fishing, she mutters. Historians still argue whether the Three Sisters system was developed independently by Mesoamerican farmers or influenced by earlier Pan-American patterns of polyculture. But there's no debate about its efficiency. It sustained millions. You look at your lunch options back home and suddenly feel very judged by your sad desk salad. You reach for a squash vine and notice how tough it is. Not in the my zucchini survived the fridge for 3 weeks way, but in the this plant could survive a minor apocalypse way. The vines act as ground anchors, holding soil in place during heavy rains and preventing erosion. Chinampas weren't just farms. They were fortresses of fertility. Another chinampa you pass is filled with amaranth. Tiny red blossoms waving like flames. It's a pseudo-cereal packed with protein, revered by the Aztecs, and banned by the Spanish for a time due to its ties to religious rituals. You glance around, half expecting a priest to appear from the reeds. Nothing but a duck. Still suspicious duck. Further down, you spot rows of chili peppers, small and deceptively innocent looking. You recall the roasted maize cake you ate earlier and realize, with slow dread, that the tingling in your mouth wasn't spiritual enlightenment, it was capsaicin. The diversity of these gardens is staggering. Not just staple crops, but herbs, flowers, medicinal plants. Even cacao saplings in the shade of taller crops. Some chinampas look like living pharmacies. Others look like color palettes exploded. You realize these weren't just functional spaces, they were aesthetic ones. A farmer here was also a designer, an ecologist, and probably someone with incredibly strong forearms. You lean down and brush your fingers along a leaf of epazote, a pungent herb used in Aztec cooking to tame the beans. It smells earthy and wild, and vaguely like your grandmother's porch garden. You start to notice patterns. Maize planted in spiral shapes, chili bushes forming a border, marigolds dotting the perimeter. These weren't random arrangements. Some scholars believe the layouts were tied to ritual cosmology, designed to mirror sacred geometries or calendar cycles. Others argue it was just good pest control, or both. It's always both. You pull into a shallow cove where a gardener kneels with a bundle of reeds and a sharp obsidian blade. He's grafting bean vines to a pole. Nearby, a small child carefully spreads crushed snail shells across the soil, adding calcium. She says, you try to look impressed instead of confused. Itzel hands you a gourd ladle filled with some kind of herbal tea. It smells like mint, smoke, and dirt. You drink it anyway. It tastes like swamp wisdom. A dragonfly lands on the edge of your canoe, then lifts off and dances across the air, tracing invisible sigils between the maize stalks. You watch until it disappears. You exhale slowly. This garden, this world feels like it exists outside time. You half expect to round a bend and find a calendar priest announcing that it's still 1431. You pass a chinampa planted entirely with flowers cempasúchils, their orange petals blazing against the green. Itzel calls them offerings, for the ancestors and for the bees. You nod, unsure which one you're more afraid of. Probably the bees. A canoe passes you carrying baskets full of nopal cactus pads and chaya leaves. The man steering it sings a tune that sounds older than the lake. You hum along without meaning to. By now, you've stopped thinking of chinampas as gardens at all. They're more like living puzzles, crafted from biology and memory. Each plant helps the others survive. Each inch of soil has been touched by generations of hands. You trail your fingers through the water again, and this time, you don't recoil. The mud is still there. The frogs, the algae, the ghosts of squash harvests past, but also clarity. The knowledge that this was a system built not by force, but by patience. And suddenly, you're very, very tired. Not the bad kind of tired, the good kind. The kind that comes from growing things. You wake from your thoughts to the unmistakable scent of something both earthy and vaguely alarming. It's not the flowers. It's not the herbs. No, this is something much more primal. Itzel points toward the edge of a nearby chinampa, where a young man is stirring a bucket of something thick and brown. He's smiling, which is suspicious. You paddle closer. He grins and lifts the bucket slightly so you can peek inside. You regret looking. Welcome to the secret of Aztec agriculture. Night soil. Yes, human waste. mixed with lake mud, mixed with decaying plants, mixed with crushed bones, fish remains, and the occasional worm smoothie. This isn't just compost, it's a living brew. It smells like guilt and historical accuracy. You try not to gag. Itzel pats your back like she's seen this reaction 100 times. Probably because she has, they called it Tulazoli, a mix of sacred refuse, returned to the earth to complete the cycle. To modern sensibilities, it's a little intense. But to the Aztecs, this wasn't gross. This was sacred ecology. What came from the earth had to go back to the earth. No waste, no nonsense. You help mix a fresh pile. The texture, it gritty. The smell, heroic. You spread it at the base of some young bean stalks and try not to think too hard about your life choices. Here's the thing. It works. This mix, combined with lake sediment rich in nutrients, made chinampa soil incredibly fertile, able to grow crops year-round. Some Spanish chroniclers swore they saw 7 harvests in a year, which sounds exaggerated until you feel how warm and wet the soil stays, how the microclimate wraps the garden like a blanket. Still, historians debate just how much of this 7 harvests claim is truth, and how much is the stunned exaggeration of a conquistador used to sandier farming. Some argue it may have been more like 3 to 4 major harvests, with small supplementary ones. Either way, more than most places, much more. You paddle toward another chinampa, where a woman is using a hollow reed straw to siphon lake mud from the canal directly into furrows between crops. She does it with the ease of someone who's been doing it since toddlerhood. The mud acts like a liquid fertilizer, replenishing the soil constantly. Nearby, a boy stands ankle-deep in water with a net. He's gathering something slimy and green. You think algae, he thinks treasure. The algae is dried, mixed with soil, and added back to the chinampa for texture and moisture retention. Nature, it turns out, doesn't have a trash bin, just very creative recycling. And now comes your next job. Worm tea. Itzel hands you a gourd with what looks like swamp espresso. It's not for drinking. Thank the gods. It's for pouring around plant roots. Inside this magical muck, microscopic armies of decomposers, microbes, bacteria, fungal threads all working 247 to break down waste and release nutrients. You pour some out carefully. The soil drinks it in like gossip. Then there's the fish guts. A canoe rows past carrying buckets of what can only be described as the worst parts of dinner. These too will be buried in chinampa beds to attract beneficial insects and boost nitrogen. Nothing is wasted here, not bones, not feathers, not even your dignity. After that night soil incident, you glance over at Itzel, who's using a bundle of dried chili stems as a rake. Another chinampa over. A woman uses a paddle carved from old maize stalks. Tools here aren't just tools, they're rebirths. Every object gets a second job before it's tossed. Sometimes a third. You start to wonder what your modern coffee mug would become in this world. Probably a seed scoop or a very tiny canoe. You settle into the rhythm. Fertilize, mix, replenish, repeat. The work is physical but not exhausting. It's meditative, like painting with mud. You realize that these gardens aren't just tended, they're fed. Like pets or gods, a heron lands beside you with the air of someone about to demand rent. You offer it a worm. It tilts its head, considers, then struts away like royalty. You have been judged and found acceptable. Later, Itzel shows you a chinampa lined with volcanic ash, crushed obsidian mixed into the soil to add minerals. Another uses crushed clam shells from the lake. There's even one with what appears to be ground-up snail shells, shimmering faintly in the dirt. You're told it keeps the beans calm. You don't ask. You pause to rest under a willow tree, its long branches brushing the water like the fingers of a tired priest. You lean your head back and feel the soil shift slightly under you, soft, forgiving, alive. And as strange as it sounds, you feel clean, not clean like soap, clean like a line, like the world. For all its mess is in order here, everything has a place, everything has a use, even the gross things, maybe especially the gross things. You dip your fingers into the soil and let them rest there. You are not floating anymore. You are part of it. The light's grown softer now, draped in the dusty amber of late afternoon. You stretch your legs over the side of the canoe, toes skimming water thick with lily pads, when something small splashes behind you. Then again, you turn slowly. A goose, no, a very large, very entitled goose is waddling down a chinampa path like it owns the whole hydrological system. You meet its gaze. It stares back. There's no fear in those eyes, only menace. Itzel chuckles. That one bites. You move on quickly. As you drift between gardens, something becomes clear. These chinampas aren't just functional, they're defended, guarded, watched over, and not just by farmers. You spot a man near the canal bank holding a long wooden pole, not for paddling, but for scaring off birds. He waves it rhythmically through the air, clapping the water now and then, sending flocks of egrets into the sky. Too many beaks, not enough beans, he mutters. A woman across the water whistles sharply and tosses a handful of chili ash into the air near her plot. It settles like fine powder on the leaves, a homemade pest deterrent. You squint. Tiny bugs scatter. The plants seem to sigh in relief. Even the willow trees along the edge have a job, keeping out intruders, animal or otherwise. Their long, drooping branches block easy access, and their scent is rumored to deter certain insects. Some say the trees listen to the water and whisper warnings when storms are near. It sounds like folklore until you feel how quickly the mood shifts when the wind picks up. You help install a rope barrier made from twisted maize husks. It runs along a particularly fertile plot of amaranth and acts as both fence and signal. This chinampa is claimed, and its crops are spoken for. No accidental harvests, no wandering ducks. Hopefully, one gardener nearby is crafting a scarecrow, though scare human might be more accurate. It's made from old reeds, tattered cloth, and what looks suspiciously like a gourd carved into a grumpy face. You find it effective. Even you don't want to cross that thing. Still, not all the threats come from above. Itzel points to a patch of disturbed soil on one edge of a garden. Water rat, she says. Big one. You imagine a creature somewhere between a beaver and your worst camping trip. She shrugs. They steal roots, chew trees. Very clever. Very rude. That night, she shows you the traditional method for keeping pests away. Night songs. Yes, singing. Some farmers hum while working. Others chant softly. Not for the crops, but for the animals. The sounds tell frogs to stay put, warn birds away, and remind the night creatures that these rows are spoken for. You try it, just a soft melody, half remembered from childhood, and feel something shift. The frogs go quiet, then, after a pause, resume croaking but at a distance. You're not sure if it worked or if they just don't like your voice. Either way, it's a win. And then there's the spiritual protection. Some chinampas have small shrines built into their corners. Not full temples, but rough stone stacks with bits of cloth, obsidian, feathers, offerings to Tlaloc, the rain god, or Chikomekotl, goddess of sustenance. You find one shrine with a burned maize cob placed carefully at its base. Another has a tiny mask made of clay, eyes closed, peaceful, possibly judging you. Historians still debate whether these mini altars were personal expressions of faith or part of a broader state-sanctioned ritual system. Either way, they're everywhere, and they feel alive. Like someone's watching. Not in a creepy way, in a don't mess with my vegetables way. You kneel beside one and place a single marigold at its base. It wilts immediately. You take it as a sign and step away. Further along, Itzel shows you how to build a natural fence using agave, spikes, and prickly pear cactus. Keeps out the raccoons, she explains, and sometimes my cousin. You laugh. She doesn't. You also learn about the watchbirds, trained herons, sometimes ducks, that respond to movement and sound alarms in their own way. It's low tech. Yes, but also genius. You spot one such heron standing guard, neck stretched tall, eyes narrowed. It squawks once as you pass. You nod respectfully. And not all guardians are feathered. One chinampa houses a small dog, curled beside a row of beans. It opens one eye as you approach, snorts, and goes back to sleep. Best watchdog in the district, says the farmer proudly. Barks at shadows, hates squash thieves. As the sky dims, you notice the perimeter of several chinampas lined with smoke pots. Small clay urns used to burn dried herbs at dusk. The smoke deters mosquitoes and, allegedly, bad spirits. It smells like sage, chili, and memory. You sit by one and let the smoke curl around you. It's strangely soothing. This place, this web of mud, plants, and guardians isn't just a farm. It's a community organism, protected not just by tools and fences, but by presence, by watchfulness, by small acts repeated 1,000 times. A chant here, a scarecrow there, a chilly line drawn carefully along the edge. You close your eyes, something rustles nearby. You don't flinch, because you know now it's probably just the goose, or the wind, or the land itself, watching back. The next morning arrives on a whisper. A gray mist curls above the lake, like steam rising off a calm mind. You wake in the canoe, half curled beneath your reed blanket, your shoulder imprinted with paddle marks and your dreams full of whispering trees. Itzel is already awake. Of course, she's sipping something hot from a clay cup and staring at the sky like she's reading it. It's maize planting day, she says, but not just because of the weather. You squint upward, cloudy, breezy. Definitely not a forecast app involved. No, today's planting isn't about conditions. It's about the calendar. The Aztecs didn't just farm by season, they farmed by cosmic choreography. And the calendar they used, complicated, beautiful, and only slightly more confusing than your inbox. You learn quickly that there were two primary calendars. The ChronoLull Pohuali, a 260-day sacred cycle made up of 20 signs, and 13 numbers, and the Shu Pohuali, a 365-day solar calendar used for agricultural and civic scheduling. Together, they created a kind of calendar braid, aligning only every 52 years like two cousins who show up at the same family reunion by accident. Today's planting, scheduled by the ChronoLull Pohuali, the priest determined that today aligns with Tochtli, the day of the rabbit associated with fertility, renewal, and just a touch of chaotic mischief. It seems right. You kneel beside Itzel on a small chinampa ringed with marigolds. She hums softly, pressing her hands into the soil before she plants. You mimic her palm. Press, breath, plant. Each seed is placed carefully, like a blessing, not tossed, not buried. Set, as though the gods are watching and taking notes. Historians still argue how strictly farmers followed the ChronoLull Pohuali. Some say every single planting had to be priest-approved. Others suggest that most chinamperos knew the system well enough to work it themselves. Farmers were not fools. The truth likely sits between devotion and practicality, locked in a slow, respectful tango. The calendar is not just days, it's personality. Every day has a tone, a spirit. A good day for chilies might be a bad one for amaranth. You don't just ask what day it is, you ask what kind of day. There are solar festivals too, like Tlacaxipehualistli, the flaying of men, associated with renewal, and Etzalcoatlistli, the corn and bean feasting month. Chinampa work didn't pause during festivals, but it did shift. You might plant less and sing more, or fast for the first half of the day, then return to the soil with a full heart and an empty stomach. Itzel shows you a small obsidian calendar disc, etched with symbols so old they look like stars pressed into stone. She runs her thumb across it and says, "Today is a good day for roots, not for fruit." You nod. Even though you're still working out what day of the week it is, you help her plant chili seeds in a separate plot. "These are moody," she warns. They listen. You consider whispering encouragement to them, but decide not to tempt fate. Later, you visit a chinampa with painted stones set into the soil in geometric patterns. "Calendar markers," says the farmer. "Each color for a phase of the moon. Each shape for a week. It looks like a game board, but it's dead serious. If you plant on the wrong moon, the maize will sulk. Everyone knows this. Some plots use shadow poles, tall sticks that cast different lengths depending on the sun's position. Farmers track these shadows throughout the year, mapping the seasons like a sundial that speaks in leaf and fruit. You meet an old man named Tenoch, who claims he once planted an entire chinampa following a dream calendar, signs shown to him in smoke and cornmeal. "Best maize of my life," he says, "also the most frogs." He doesn't elaborate. You don't ask. You learn that the calendar isn't just about timing, it's about respect. Planting without regard for the date is like speaking in someone else's house without permission. The soil has moods. The moon has opinions. Itzel tells you of Tlazolteotl, goddess of fertility and filth, beloved and feared. Farmers sometimes whisper prayers to her before they turn compost, asking for forgiveness and productivity in the same breath. You find yourself muttering her name when a wheelbarrow of wormy muck tips onto your boots. There are omens too, if the waterbirds fly west before planting. Delay the beans. If your canoe rocks for no reason before sunrise, offer tobacco. If your foot sinks knee-deep in muck on the same day a dog barks 3 times, don't plant. Go home. Drink atoll. Try again tomorrow. It all seems absurd until it doesn't. Until you see a chinampa that yields nothing despite perfect technique. Until another flourishes against the odds. Until the herons fly low and the frogs fall silent. And you start wondering if maybe, just maybe, the calendar isn't about superstition, it's about listening. Not to logic, not to weather, but to rhythm. You end the day planting last year's saved seeds carefully selected, dried, and stored according to tradition. Itzel holds them like glass, you cradle them like wishes, and when you press them into the soil, it feels like the lake nods. It's a good day. The calendar said so. The sun is high now, blinding and sharp. The kind that makes you question every life decision involving long sleeves and no hat. You squint up at the sky and paddle onward, following Itzel toward a series of chinampas bordered with something different. Palm leaf flags fluttering at each corner, brightly dyed and arranged with precision. Warrior plots, she says, with a half smile. Special deliveries. You pull up beside a large rectangular chinampa with rows of green vegetables so meticulously arranged. You'd think they were auditioning for a parade. Lettuce, chaya, wild celery, and bundles of herbs in tight formation. This isn't for the marketplace. It's for someone with feathers in their helmet and obsidian in their breakfast. Yes, the Aztec military needed salads, too. Turns out, even jaguar knights and eagle warriors needed fiber. A balanced warrior was a strong warrior. Muscles were fueled not just by meat, but by maize, beans, and sometimes weird, leafy things that made you feel weirdly healthy. You trail behind Itzel as she explains the supply chain. One chinampa provides greens to the household of a mid-level captain, another to the Comicak, the military academy. The most productive plots reserved for the Tlatoani's court, including elite guards and palace attendants, some of whom were expected to look fierce and be regular. Historians still debate how centralized these food systems were. Some argue the state directed specific chinampas to serve military needs, while others believe it was more of an honor system. Families who owed military service contributed crops instead of manpower. Either way, there were chinampas whose sole job was to feed warriors, and those crops had to be perfect. You crouch beside a patch of Quolite's wild greens with a peppery tang. Itzel points out that they grow quickly, need little maintenance, and pack enough nutrients to keep a warrior's knees from giving out during long marches. You nod, pretending to understand war knees. Another farmer nearby is harvesting purslane, placing each bundle carefully into reed baskets. She hums a war chant softly as she works, and you get the feeling this isn't just farming, it's preparation. There's a gravity here, the same way you'd sharpen a blade or oil a shield. These plants are being polished into edible discipline. Some chinampas even grow plants for wounds, herbs used in battlefield salves, pain relief, and, occasionally, to knock someone out long enough to sew a gash. You help collect yarrow, a feathery little plant that smells like rain and iron. Stops bleeding, says Itzel. Also makes tea that makes you dream of snakes. You make a mental note not to drink that. You pass a canoe loaded with food bundles, tight rolls of maize leaves, stuffed with squash blossoms and amaranth paste, probably en route to a barracks or palace gate. The boy steering it has warrior tattoos down one arm, though he looks barely 15. Training, says Itzel, reading your face. They start early, but they eat well. One chinampa has wooden effigies standing in the corners, each shaped like a soldier, each holding a clay spear. You ask why? To remind the crops who they serve. The farmer says, not smiling. You don't ask twice. As you paddle deeper into the warrior plots, the vibe shifts. Everything is neater, tighter, rows like regiments, crops planted with military precision, as though disorder would offend the god of war. Huitzilopochtli, himself. Itzel explains that in peak times, food from chinampas was sent daily to Tenochtitlan's great temples, where it fed warriors and priests alike. Some chinampas were even dedicated in honor of victory plots blessed after battles, their produce deemed sacred. Eating from them was part meal, part ritual. You pass a chinampa with nothing but chia growing in broad, dark rows. Not just a trendy smoothie ingredient, chia was a tribute crop, often gifted to temples or warrior lodges. When you pick a handful, it feels like lifting centuries. Off in the distance, you hear drumming. Slow, steady, you pause. Itzel listens. Training ground, she says. They practice there. You can hear it through the lake sometimes. The roots feel it. You let that sink in. The roots feel it. Everything here, every stalk, every vine tied to something larger. Not just nourishment, but intention. Even a chili bush knows its job. As the sun begins to slide down the sky again, you help harvest a pile of nopal cactus pads, carefully slicing them with a stone blade and piling them in woven baskets. Your hands sting a little from the spines, but you don't mind. This food has purpose, and you're part of the chain, even if just for today. Back at the canal's edge, a young girl tosses an ear of maize into the water with a whispered prayer for the brave ones, she says, and walks away. You watch the maize float, spin, then sink gently, like it knows where it's going. The water ripples, and for a moment, the chinampas around you feel like they're standing at attention. And in the middle of it all, a lettuce leaf flutters. Salute accepted. It starts with a splash, not a graceful paddle stroke or the plunk of a heron landing, but a chaotic, sloshing, shouting kind of splash. You and Itzel look up just in time to see two canoes locked together, oars tangled, baskets of maize floating away like tiny, doomed rafts. Market argument, she mutters, or maybe politics. Turns out, even in paradise, tempers flare. This chinampa cluster lies close to an old canal crossroad, where garden plots squeeze up against one another. There's barely space for canoes to pass without bumping. And if one farmer's chili crop spills into another's flower bed, it's not just a gardening mishap, it's a turf war. You pass another boat headed in the opposite direction, stacked high with baskets and guarded by an older woman holding a paddle like a club. She nods politely. Her dog doesn't. Welcome to the part of chinampa life they don't put in the poetry. Conflict, competition, sometimes war. Yes, war. You think of chinampas as quiet, humble plots of green. But during Aztec expansion, and especially in the later imperial era, these gardens weren't just food sources, they were strategic assets. You paddle alongside Itzel as she explains how, in times of siege or drought, the empire relied on these gardens to stay alive, which meant enemy armies often tried to sabotage them first. Cut a canal, ruin the plot, she says. Burn the edges, poison the silt. Doesn't take much. Historians still argue whether the chinampas were true targets in formal military campaigns or simply collateral damage. But archaeological evidence of scorched layers, buried weapons, and collapsed canals suggest someone, somewhere, turned farming into a battlefield. You float by a section where the willows are younger, thinner. A regrown chinampa, Itzel explains, burned in a raid. The trees don't forget. The idea of waterborne war seems surreal, until you imagine canoes loaded with warriors racing through the canals, obsidian-bladed clubs raised, striking not only enemies, but the land that fed them. One spark, one floodgate opened at the wrong time, and a whole season's harvest lost. A chill runs through you, not from the water, but from the realization that this place is fragile. The lake gives, the lake also takes. Some of the chinamperos you meet later carry old scars, slash marks on their arms, eyes clouded with stories they no longer tell. You don't ask, but you do listen when Itzel leads you past a shrine marked with a single black feather and a row of polished stones. That one remembers, she says quietly, and not all battles were external. There were rivalries between noble families, disputes over land boundaries, arguments over who got which section of silt-rich canal. Even today, some plots are the subject of century-old family feuds. You help one man harvest squash, and he won't even say the name of the neighboring gardener. just gestures across the canal with his nose and mutters, "He waters too loud." One farmer tells you about chinampa drift when garden edges start creeping, slowly, subtly, into the canal or toward another plot, not floating exactly, but shifting, reshaping. A stolen foot of soil, he says, can start a decade of bitterness. You believe him? You pass another canal junction where a stone carving marks an old defensive line. A relic from the time when this was a border zone between rival city-states. The carving depicts a jaguar biting a reed raft. It's unsettling, effective. You paddle faster, but it wasn't all violence. Sometimes, the conflict led to innovation. To avoid sabotage, farmers developed more secure mooring systems, stronger canal levees, and even secret seed banks, hidden in waterproof gourd jars and buried in the shallows. Some of these have been recovered tiny time capsules of maize and amaranth. Still viable, still dreaming of sun. You help haul a bundle of firewood to a chinampa near the old battlegrounds. Its owner, an elderly woman named Maquistzin, shows you where a long groove runs through her plot arrow trail. She says, during a skirmish long ago, this garden was used for cover. You walk it slowly, feeling the past in every step. And yet, the garden grows. Beans twine up maize. Squash leaves hug the dirt. A heron stands on one leg and stares at you like it knows everything. That's the final lesson of chinampa warfare. Resilience. These gardens bend. They break. They even burn. But they come back. You sit under a tree that was planted 2 years after the last known raid. Its roots now thick enough to crack a canoe. Its branches sway like nothing ever happened. You ask Itzel if the land remembers. She just smiles. The land forgives. That's why it feeds us. You dip your hand into the canal, where the water is darker, deeper, somewhere beneath it. Layers of history lie folded like wet cloth ash. Seeds, blood, blossoms. You feel it. The tension between growth and destruction, between feeding and fighting. And then, across the canal, someone plays a flute, a single note, soft, forgiving. The chinampas exhale and keep growing. Evening slips in like a cat, quiet, long-limbed, and curious. The light turns honey-colored, slanting low across the chinampas. You and Itzel paddle into a part of the lake that feels different, still hushed. There are fewer birds here, no chatter of market boats or children splashing in the shallows, only the slow creak of wood, the hum of insects, and the faint sound of something that might be singing or might just be wind slipping through reeds. You pass a chinampa that's been left fallow. The maize is dry. The amaranth has gone to seed. A small shrine sits at the edge stone basin. Incense ash, and a few wilting marigolds. Itzel nods toward it. This one's for the dead. You drift into a part of the lake where chinampas take on another role, not just farms, but sacred spaces, plots set aside for ritual, for memory, for the kind of farming that doesn't yield crops but connection. You dock at a narrow strip of earth bordered by obsidian shards pressed into the soil like jagged teeth. At the center is a small altar, smeared with red ochre, and surrounded by offerings, twisted maize husks, feathers, a tiny bowl of water, and something that looks suspiciously like dried blood. You don't ask. You just sit beside Itzel as she lights a twist of dried copal and holds it above her head. The smoke rises in spirals, and the air smells like history. Chinampas weren't just for eating, she says softly. They were for remembering, for appeasing, for asking. You look around. Several other altar plots are scattered nearby, each with its own shape, its own offering logic. Some are overgrown, some meticulously clean. One is circled with chili bushes, another marked with a single, enormous sunflower bent like a prayer. Historians still debate whether every farmer kept a shrine on their land, or if these were reserved for religious specialists. But it's clear that agriculture and spirituality weren't separate here. They were braided together, like beans on maize. You kneel beside one shrine and spot a small clay mask, half buried in the dirt. Its expression is blank, or maybe serene, or maybe annoyed, you can't tell. You place a flower beside it anyway. Later, you help a young woman scatter amaranth seeds across a plot meant for her grandmother. She mixes them with crushed bone, which you try not to comment on, and chant softly. The words make no sense to you, but the tone does. You move on to a chinampa lined with floating candles, tiny flames drifting on bark boats. For those who drowned, says Itzel, to a garden where wild orchids grow between the rows, untouched by harvest. Spirits rest here, says the old man tending them. Don't pick, just look, to a plot where nothing grows at all. Just stone, water, and silence. It's unsettling, peaceful, heavy. You find yourself speaking less. Even the frogs are quiet here. You watch a girl pour water onto the soil and whisper names. Not loudly, not dramatically, just names, as though the land might carry them. And maybe it does, because here's the thing. The lake has layers, literally. Each chinampa sits atop decades of previous ones, crumbled and folded back into the water. Sometimes farmers find old tools, bones, carved figures. Sometimes they leave them where they are. Disturbing the past is risky. One farmer shows you a buried pot he uncovered last week, filled with obsidian blades and teeth. He's afraid to touch it. It was an offering, he says, for rain or war, or maybe both. Some plots are said to be cursed. One yields only bitter squash. Another attracts snakes but no bees. You pass one where the plants lean sideways, as if avoiding something in the center. Itzel doesn't stop there. You don't ask. As dusk deepens, you help light more candles. You place one on a bark raft and push it gently into the canal. It drifts, bobs, catches a breeze. You watch it until it disappears around a bend, swallowed by the dark, and then something catches your eye. A figure, standing motionless at the far edge of a shrine, chinampa, cloaked in white, face hidden, watching. You blink and it's gone. You look at Itzel. She's still kneeling, eyes closed, lips moving. You decide not to mention the figure. This part of the chinampa world isn't about knowing. It's about feeling, about tending to the soil and the soul at once, about growing something not for food, but for the dead, for the gods, or for the parts of you that don't make it into the daylight. Night fully settles now. The lake stills. You lie back in the canoe, watching stars rippled in the water, blurred by the faint smoke of incense and drifting candlelight. You close your eyes, and if someone whispers your name from the reeds, you don't respond. Some offerings aren't yours to answer. The next morning arrives draped in silver mist, and the faint smell of tamales warming over charcoal. You're sore in places you forgot you had, and your hands are still stained with mud and flower ash. But Itzel's already moving, pulling the canoe toward the edge of a busy waterway. Market day, she says. Bring your manners. You pull into a wide canal where chinampas have turned into floating booths. Canoes become pop-up shops, and farmers transform into merchants armed with wit, fast math, and better deals for people they like. You are not yet one of those people. This is Xochimilco's Lake Market, and it's a slow-moving carnival of produce, barter, gossip, and that one duck who always steals chili peppers when no one's looking. You dock beside a canoe stacked high with tomatoes, their red skins glowing like wet jewels. Next to it, a woman slices cactus pads into neat bundles while shouting prices in Nahuatl and laughing mid-bargain. You offer to help. She hands you a squash and tells you to look menacing. You try. She laughs harder. All around you, the lake buzzes with commerce. Canoes drift by loaded with flowers, herbs, eggs, axolotls in clay jars, baskets of quail feathers, bundles of chili stems, and sacks of cornmeal so fine it floats on the air like powdered gold. There's no money changing hands, at least not in the way you expect. Here, it's mostly barter. A basket of beans for 2 squash and a pinch of dried oregano. A bundle of amaranth traded for a pot of honey and a good story. You try to follow along but quickly realize that value here is social as much as agricultural. Historians note that the Aztec economy ran on a complex mix of tribute, barter, and standardized trade, especially in places like this. Markets were regulated by appointed officials, and cheating was punishable by public humiliation, often involving loud shouting and possibly feathers. You instinctively clutch your squash a little tighter. You help Itzel unload her canoe, maize cakes, bundle herbs, and a surprisingly aggressive goose she insists is for trade. You're not sure who'll take it, but you're rooting for whoever does. She sets up her plot by mooring the canoe against a floating platform, a mobile chinampa, more raft than farm, layered with flowers and reed mats. Within minutes, regulars stop by. There's banter, teasing, An older man hands Itzel a bundle of dried fish in exchange for a spicy green sauce she keeps in a calabash gourd. No words, just a nod. You paddle around on your own and encounter a canoe manned by two teenage boys selling candied squash flowers and something called lake cheese, which you don't ask too many questions about. It's salty. It's weirdly good. You buy a pouch in exchange for the only thing you have, a smile and a drawing like you made in the mud. They accept it. Barely. You pass by a stall well, a canoe anchored sideways selling only tools carved from bone, spades, hooks, even a whistle shaped like a frog. The merchant tells you it's good for getting rid of rude herons. You buy one immediately. It doesn't work, but it makes a satisfying sound. Then there's the musicians. A canoe drifts past with two flautists in feathered cloaks playing haunting tunes that make the water ripple as if in response. Another floats by with a singer whose voice turns heads without trying. You realize quickly that not all market currency is edible songs are traded. 2. As are blessings, gossip, and romantic advice that may or may not be a trap. You spot a group gathered around a canoe painted with bright red symbols, a storyteller reciting a tale of how the first chinampa was grown from a god's spilled blood and a handful of starlight. The listeners lean in. You do too. The story goes nowhere in particular, but you love every second. Later, you help Itzel gather her leftover produce. She barters some, saves some, and offers the rest to a nearby communal chinampa, one of many plots kept for those who can't farm or who've fallen on hard times. You help unload the canoe quietly. No one talks. It's just done. A system that expects you to care. You sit beside Itzel as the market winds down, the sun sliding west, the canoes drifting apart like petals falling from a bloom. Someone hands you a reed cup of pulque, a fermented Maggi drink that tastes like sour bread and poor decisions. You sip it anyway. It grows on you, or possibly through you. A boy waves at you from another boat. He's holding your mud drawing. You wave back. And for once, don't feel like a tourist in someone else's story. The lake settles again. Canoes turn homeward. Torches are lit along the canal banks, flickering in the wind like fireflies who've been promoted. You lie back in the canoe, the squash you protected all day tucked behind your head like a lumpy pillow. You hear laughter in the distance. Someone strums a stringed instrument. The goose honks one last time, hopefully in someone else's canoe. This wasn't just a market. It was a memory trade. And tonight, you're full of both. You wake to a strange sound silence. Not the usual lake quiet, filled with frog croaks, paddle splashes, and the gossip of birds. This is a stillness so absolute it hums. The sky is colorless. The air hangs heavy. Itzel squints at the horizon. Something's wrong, she says, and then the wind changes. A sharp gust kicks up a fine spray from the water, scattering lily pads and sending herons into the sky like frightened thoughts. You brace against the side of the canoe as a second gust follows. Then a third angrier, more urgent, storm. She says simply, and not just any storm, a chinampa breaking, canal flooding, mud-sucking monster of a storm. The weather here isn't an afterthought. It's the god of the wheat. You've seen what too much rain does to the carefully balanced gardens, turns them to slush, collapses their edges, drowns the roots in sorrow. But too little rain. Even worse, you and Itzel paddle hard toward the edge of a chinampa, securing the canoe to a willow tree with a soaked reed rope. All around, other farmers are doing the same, battening their floating lives to anything that will hold. This is not new to them. They've lived through years of flood. When Lake Texcoco surged past its boundaries, swallowing homes and gardens whole. And they've lived through years of drought, when the lake shrank and cracked, and the chinampas sat baking under a sun that refused to blink. You help lash down a reed fence as the first drops fall slow at first, then all at once, a deluge. The soil drinks greedily, but the canals begin to rise. You spot one chinampa young, not yet fully anchored, starting to drift. It bumps into another, tearing at the edges. Farmers shout, ropes are thrown, mud splashes. It's chaos, in slow motion. And this isn't even the worst of it. Itzel mutters under her breath something about Tlaloc, the rain god, being in a mood. You believe it. The sky splits with thunder, and suddenly, the lake feels like it's shifting under you, tipping, leaning. thinking about how much it truly wants to be a lake today. Historians still argue how the Aztecs managed long-term weather challenges. Some say they built dikes and sluice systems, carefully separating fresh water from brackish zones. Others believe local farmers developed informal flood-sharing agreements, where water was channeled deliberately into less vital plots to save others. No one agrees entirely, but they all agree. The weather could break you if you weren't ready. You and Itzel move fast. She digs channels around the base of a chinampa using a paddle and her bare hands. You join her, dragging bundles of reeds to divert the water. It's a soggy mess. Your knees are soaked. Your back is aching. Your teeth are clenching without permission. And then it stops, just like that. As if the gods got distracted, the water settles. The frogs resume their chorus. The sky lightens to a watery gray. You stand in the wreckage. A few plants are bent. One corner of a chinampa has slid into the canal, forming a messy slope of mud and tangled squash vines. But it's not gone. Itzel nods. Could have been worse. You agree? Mostly because you're too tired to do anything else. Later, as the sun returns, you help replant what was lost. A dozen hands show up at neighbors, cousins, even the goose. No one complains. No one blames. They just work. Because the lake always changes, and the chinampas must always adapt. One man shows you a flood calendar carved into wood, with tiny grooves marking past years of drought and overflow. This year's a bellyful. He says, last year was bones. You nod, unsure which is worse. Another woman digs storm markers into her soil. Tiny clay faces, each one representing a major rain. They look up at you with knowing expressions. You feel watched, encouraged, slightly scolded. You spend the afternoon collecting floating debris sticks, leaves, a single drowned sandal you don't ask about. You also find a small, sodden figurine made of maize dough, shaped like a frog, a storm offering. Perhaps you set it gently on a dry rock to rest. By evening, the chinampas are back in place, rough around the edges, but alive. The roots held. The trees swayed but didn't fall. You see a boy replanting beans with slow, careful hands and realize he's doing exactly what his ancestors did 500 years ago, refusing to give up. You paddle through the calm, past chinampas that still glisten from the storm. Some are silent, others hum with repair, and in each one, something grows. Not because the weather is kind, but because the people are stubborn, patient, brave. You ask Itzel if the storms ever stop coming. She smiles. No, but neither do we. You watch the sun slip behind the trees, their soaked roots now steaming slightly in the last light. Tomorrow, you'll rebuild. Tonight, you'll sleep in a garden that almost floated away. The air is different today. It carries the faintest edge of salt, not strong, not stinging, but enough to make your tongue curl and your nose wrinkle. You look at Itzel, who's already frowning. The tide's coming from the east, she says, without looking up. And the smell isn't ours. You've arrived at a turning point in the story of the chinampas. Because one day, the Spanish showed up, and they brought hooves. You paddle silently past a line of chinampas where the maize has gone yellow too early. The plants lean strangely, as if confused by the direction of the sun. One has tire-like ruts pressed into its edge, except tires don't exist yet. But horses do. When the Spanish conquistadors entered the Valley of Mexico in the early 1500s, led by Hernán Cortés, they were immediately baffled, not just by the floating gardens, but by the entire ecosystem. Canals instead of streets, canoes instead of carts, land that wobbled when you stepped on it. Historians still argue whether Cortés saw the chinampas as clever or demonic. Either way, they didn't survive his admiration. You pass an old farmer who gestures toward a sunken patch of land. Used to grow sunflowers here, he says, until they brought pigs. He spits into the water. The pigs never left. European animals were a disaster in this fragile system. Horses, pigs, goats. They didn't just trample the gardens. They dug, chewed, rooted, and sank them. Even a single hoof could collapse a freshly built chinampa. And unlike the delicate balance of maize, beans, and squash, these animals didn't know how to live with the land. They came to use it, not join it. You dock beside a chinampa that's little more than a muddy memory, its outline barely visible under a layer of swamp grass. Burned, Itzel says. During the siege, You nod, even though you know which siege she means. The Siege of Tenochtitlan, 1521. The chinampas became not just farms, but battlefields and sometimes weapons. The Aztecs used them for cover, for supply, and for retreat. The Spanish used fire and steel. The lake that had once fed a nation turned red, and the floating gardens sank beneath the tide of gunpowder and foreign boots. One canal you pass is wider than the others, not naturally, dug out by soldiers. Someone tells you to bring cannons closer. The idea of cannons in a vegetable garden is absurd and tragic and real. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Chinampa system limped on, half-choked. The Spanish tried to reshape the valley draining lakes, redirecting water, imposing new land ownership systems. Some chinampas were converted into European-style estates. Others were abandoned. The vast network that once fed hundreds of thousands became a skeleton of its former self. And yet, not all was lost. You paddle toward Xochimilco, where some chinampas survived tucked away in corners, protected by stubborn families who knew better than to surrender to concrete. The Spanish, for all their ambitions, couldn't kill the roots. Many chinamperos kept their plots alive in secret. They worked by moonlight, passed down techniques in whispers, hid seeds in baskets of reeds. Even priests, once forbidden from blessing pagan gardens, eventually gave in and sprinkled holy water on squash with a side eye. You pass a chinampa with a tiny clay cross next to a stone mask. Two symbols, side by side. Neither wins, neither loses. They just coexist. A man shows you a reed basket filled with old seed varieties. Maize kernels red, black, blue, from before. He says, still good. He plants them carefully, reverently. You kneel beside him, help bury one. Itself tells you of a legend that when the last chinampa dies, the lake will rise again, not to drown the valley, but to remind people what they forgot, that they lived with water, not above it. That mud can feed you better than marble. You pass a school canoe, 3 children laughing as they plant herbs into clay pots. One drops hers into the water. The others tease. She splashes them. The lake watches. The modern city is close now. You can see buildings peeking through the trees. But here, for now, it feels far away, like a bad dream you almost forgot. You pause at a chinampa, where a stone plaque reads, simply, here, we grow what they tried to bury. You don't speak. There's nothing to say. Later, as the sun lowers, you help haul a canoe up onto dry reeds. The old hull creaks. It's been patched many times. It's not elegant, but it floats. Still, and maybe that's the lesson of the chinampas. Not their genius, not their yield, but their survival despite conquest, despite concrete, despite hooves. You look down at the water and see your reflection blurry, softened by the ripples. You think, if they can rise again, maybe so can you. You're drifting now, not just across water, but through time, through roots, through stories. The sun is low, turning the lake golden, like it's been gilded for some silent ceremony. You paddle slowly beside itself as the world softens around you. You've come to the final garden. Not the biggest, not the most fertile, but something about it feels anchored. The chinampa hums beneath your feet. Willow branches hang low, touching the surface like they're brushing hair. Marigolds bloom in polite clusters. Beans spiral gently around maize stalks. Even the squash, ever dramatic, seems to lounge rather than sprawl. This is modern-day Xochimilco, and this garden, it's still here, still fed by water drawn through pre-Columbian canals, still planted by hands that remember, still whispering back to a world that rarely listens. You kneel beside a row of kyi. Itzel joins you, her knees popping like old wood. This one's mine, she says, has been for 4 generations. Maybe more. She doesn't sound proud. She sounds steady. You help her clear a bit of debris, a plastic bottle half buried in the soil, a candy wrapper wedged in a root tangle. You toss them into a basket and sigh, because modern life has crept in. Noise, pollution, tour boats with loudspeakers, drifting karaoke, drones overhead, Instagrammers squatting in flower beds for the perfect shot of ancient vibes. And yet, the chinampa grows. Tourists come and go, but the roots stay. You glance up. Overhead, a heron perches on a low branch, not watching, not guarding, just being. You nod at it. It does not nod back. In the distance, a mariachi band warms up in a party boat. You hear a few opening chords, then a long, off-key trumpet blast. Itzel groans. Every weekend, she says. Still, she plants. She tells you about a community project, young people reclaiming abandoned chinampas, cleaning the canals, restoring the soil, growing native herbs their grandparents only remembered in songs. One group recently replanted an entire island with amaranth, then named it after a local grandmother. They even built her a bench, Itzel says, so she could sit and watch the bees. She tells you about school programs, kids learning Nahuatl words for plants, drawing calendars on chalkboards, listening to elders who explain why planting on a rabbit day is better than on a wind day. She tells you about the bees returning, the frogs, even an axolotl spotted last spring in a clean canal, blinking up like a dream with gills. It's not easy. The city is creeping closer. Developers whisper promises. People move away. And still, the chinampa grows. You walk the edge, careful not to slip. Its firm underfoot layers of history holding you up. You pause near a young willow, no thicker than your wrist. Itzel touches it gently. My daughter planted this one when her son was born. You ask if she thinks he'll keep the garden. She shrugs. He says he will. That's enough for now. You paddle a final lap around the plot. A few tourists wave at you from a boat decorated with paper flowers. You wave back. One takes a picture. You offer a peace sign. They cheer. It's surreal. It's sincere. It's strange. It's survival. Because these chinampas are more than agriculture, they're resistance with roots, a soft refusal to disappear, a memory that insists on being green. You reach into the water one last time and pull up a handful of black, sticky soil. It smells like the past, like the future, like a story that won't end. No matter how many buildings rise nearby, you press your hand into the dirt, leave a print, just one. Then you wipe it off, smile, and say nothing, because here, the garden speaks for itself. And now, the lake is still again. The sky folds gently into night. The willows sway not in protest, but in peace. The frogs begin their evening chorus. Soft, deliberate, as if tuning the world for sleep. Your canoe rocks just a little with each ripple, each exhale of the earth beneath you. You lie back. Let your shoulders sink. The stars above are barely visible through the haze, but you know they're there. Always have been. Just like the gardens, just like the hands that built them. You think of all the layers beneath the surface of mud, of seeds, of effort, of mistakes and fixes and more mistakes, patched together by patience. You think of the ghosts tucked into roots, and the future blooming from compost. You think of maize kernels pressed into the earth by fingers that believed they'd rise. And somehow, they did. Still do. You hear a splash nearby, maybe a fish, maybe a frog, maybe the lake shifting its weight in the dark. You feel it, not floating, but held. And in that stillness, in that slow, ancient breath of the chinampas, you feel something else, too. Permission to rest, to root, to let go. So you do. You close your eyes. The canoe creaks once. The wind brushes your hair. A bird somewhere murmurs its last word, and the gardens grow on quietly, steadily, even now, even here, even as you sleep.